If there's one word that comes to mind when you mention Germany, it's engineering, and that is most definitely the case when looking at the HEDDphone 2. In the headphone market, we have a lot of new products coming out each year, but most of these are improvements to and revisions upon existing designs. And it's pretty rare that you see something and you go, ooh, that's clever. But this is clever. The original headphone had a bit of an issue, which was the ergonomics. It simply did not fit people with larger heads, including myself. It was very heavy, it was very bulky, and that was made worse by the fact that the headband didn't really do a great job of distributing the weight on top of your head. But with the HEDDphone 2, HED seems to have not only taken that criticism and remedied those issues, but also come up with some clever solutions to problems that exist across the headphone space as well. Gone is the single padded headband from the original headphone, and in its place is a carbon fiber arc and padded suspension strap. This immediately makes the headphone substantially lighter, even more so thanks to the lighter redesigned drivers and driver cups, and much more comfortable. As well as now just fitting those with larger noggins, like myself, without issue. For comparison, I have to wear a HEDDphone Sesvara or HE1000 on the second to last notch, and Sennheiser HD800 or almost all Focal headphones I have to wear on maximum. But with the HEDDphone 2, I've got 2 notches to spare. But what is this second strap? Well, that's the clever part, and HED actually has a patent pending for this. This second strap loops up near the top of the headband here and allows you to adjust clamping pressure, and it works very well, taking it anywhere from almost no clamp at all to so clampy I can't even get them on my head. So you'll be able to get a comfortable fit regardless of whether your head is big or small. Some people may take issue with the fact that the headband arc is quite large and a little bit less than fashionable, so if the aesthetics are important to you, that's worth keeping in mind, but personally, I gave up on at-home use headphones being fashionable a while ago, and I would much rather that they be as comfortable as these are. The one thing I'm not so keen on about the ergonomics of the HEDDphone 2 is the fact that when you move your head around a bunch and change the pressure in the cups, you can hear the drivers crinkling a little bit, just like that. It's inherent to having an AMT driver in a headphone, and it's nothing to worry about, it's just a little bit annoying. The HEDDphone 2 sound signature is overall relatively mid-forward, but it exceeds a lot of otherwise more analytically tuned headphones in absolute technical performance. The first thing to talk about is the detail retrieval and how fast the HEDDphone 2 sound. So one of the theoretical benefits of using an AMT driver is that because you've got 2 parts of the driver squeezing together and pushing air out from between them, rather than a dynamic or a planar driver where it moves forward and backwards and pushes the air directly, on an AMT driver, the air moves at a resulting speed about 4 times faster than the driver is moving, whereas it's 1-to-1 with a dynamic or a planar driver. So you've got less actual driver mass to move in order to push air the same distance compared to other driver types, and the resulting sound, at least in this interpretation, is one that provides a near electrostatic headphone level of resolution. In particular, the microdynamics, the really quiet components of songs, stand out as being much clearer and better resolved on a HEDDphone 2 than on something such as a HEDDphone Aria, for instance. In the track Sublime by Slender Bodies, listening on the HEDDphone 2 versus the HEDDphone Aria Stealth, the separation of instruments and vocals on the HEDDphone 2 is quite noticeably ahead. They sound completely independent, and even the really quiet, breathy components of vocals, even at points when he's almost whispering, are just clearer on the HEDDphone 2. You can almost ignore the guitar and the drums, whereas on the Aria Stealth, whilst it's still a very technically capable headphone, it's still very good in that regard, that really low-level resolution is just not there to the same degree that it is on the HEDDphone 2. Particularly when the track is busier and there's more stuff happening. And this is despite the fact that when you're A-Bing, comparing directly side by side, for the first 10 to 20 seconds or so of listening, the Aria does come across as more detailed because the headphone is darker, it's got less treble. But once you adjust to the tuning change and actually focus on a particular element, you realize, oh no, there is just quite clearly more detail, there is more information being presented to you on the headphone. The resolution on these is seriously getting onto that provided by electrostatic headphones. It's just not bright and in your face about it. The level of treble on the HEDDphone 2 is darker than neutral, particularly within the ear gain region, so about 1500 Hz to about 10 kHz. It's definitely a few dB lower than neutral there, but then actually above 10K, it goes back up and above again. So it's dark, but quite airy and spacious sounding at the same time. In terms of sound stage, these are very wide, but not that deep frontally. So as you go out past a sort of 45-degree angle either side of you, things can get really far away. It can throw things a much greater distance than most headphones can. These are very wide staging headphones, but then as you get closer to sort of being in front of you again, which is usually vocals, things are much more intimate. It can't throw things particularly far out in front of you. Some people are really going to like that combination of quite intimate and close-up vocals with more spacious everything else. Personally though, I would have liked it if it could throw things out in front of you more. They are super wide, I just wish that they could stage a little bit further in front of you. Part of me wonders if a more spacious pad would help that. The pads on these are really comfortable, but they do touch your ears ever so slightly, and most of the headphones which have a bigger stage overall, particularly the ones that can stage out in front of you further, such as a HEDDphone Zasvara, HEDDphone Aria, or Sennheiser HD800, have quite cavernous front volumes, so maybe a more spacious pad would help with that staging a bit. The mids though, all these are nice, and the timbre is excellent. The Merry-Go-Round of Life by Grassini Project. That is a track which has a mix of piano and strings recorded in a live environment, and these headphones bring that track to life. It sounds excellent on these. The microdynamics in particular that these AMT drivers can present give you a really realistic sense of decay and feel of the environment that track was recorded in. And comparing that track on the HEDDphone 2 to the Sennheiser HD800S or the HEDDphone Aria Stealth, those headphones almost sound a little bit compressed in comparison. Vocals on the HEDDphone 2, whilst intimate in terms of their apparent physical distance from you, the actual character and timbre of them was simply terrific. And whilst listening, I was thinking, these are doing vocals as well as, and in fact, in a very similar way, to the Sennheiser HD650. Now that's a headphone which is known for, above all else, how well it does vocals. And as it turns out, there's a few reasons as to why the HEDDphone 2 might share some similarities with the 650 in that regard. Stick around to the objective section to make sure you don't miss that. And then we get to the bass. Now, the bass on these is quite unique sounding. They are very punchy and tactile. The speed and impact of bass elements is excellent for anything heavy in percussion or electronic music, and a lot better than what you'd get on most planar headphones in particular. That leading edge is super fast, and Not Like This by Emotional Oranges shows that off quite nicely. But the overall control and definition of more continuous bass elements is better than what I've experienced on most dynamic driver headphones, and Blind by Bronson at 1 minute shows that off quite nicely. So in some ways, you get the kind of best of both worlds from a planar and dynamic driver headphone, maybe even a little bit better. But whilst the bass is excellent from a technical standpoint, there is a little bit of a drop when you get to about 40 Hz or so. So into the sub bass, you do lose a little bit of that deep reaching extension. So for tracks demanding really deep reaching thunderous rumble, you might not get it in quite the same way that a flat extending planar would give, but it's still got more sub bass than most dynamic driver headphones, and we'll see that in a sec. This is the frequency response of the HEDDphone 2 as measured on a B&K 5128. I'm going to leave this here for a moment for those that prefer this sort of presentation, but we are actually moving towards a way of presenting measurements where we compensate the frequency response to the diffuse field response and then tilt the whole response so that you can more easily see how the measurement of the headphone compares to a diffuse field plus tilt response, rather than the parallel lines illusion making things, particularly in the ear gain region, sometimes a bit misleading. Let's start in the treble. Above 10 kHz, the HEDDphone 2's frequency response is generally above the diffuse field plus tilt response, meaning it's going to sound a little bit more open and airy. And some people find that a rise in this particular area contributes to a larger sounding soundstage. As we go lower in the treble though, into the ear gain region, you can see that it does dip at least a few dB below, and that produces an overall slightly darker sound signature. But I did also mention earlier that I found the vocals on the HEDDphone 2 were reminding me quite a lot of those on the Sennheiser HD650. And as it turns out, the responses in this area are remarkably similar. Comparing the Sennheiser HD650 and the HEDDphone 2, you can see that the actual shape or profile of the ear gain region response has a lot in common, just overall lower on the HEDDphone 2. So maybe that's part of the reason as to why vocals in particular sound absolutely excellent on both of these headphones in a very similar manner. Heading down into the mid-range of the HEDDphone 2, it overall sticks quite closely to the diffuse field plus tilt response, with a bit of a bump above 1 kHz. The bass extends in a relatively linear fashion right up until we get to about 40 or 50 Hz, which is where there's a sudden dip, reaching about -6 dB by the time we get to 20 Hz. This is noticeable, but it's not bothersome. It still has 4 or 5 dB more sub-bass than the HD650 we were comparing to earlier, for example, but if you're used to planar headphones, most of them have a very flat extension, and so this won't have quite the same deep-reaching rumble as those, unless you add it back in with EQ. These are great without any EQ. You absolutely do not need any EQ for these, but I would strongly recommend trying it just because the technical performance of the bass on these is so top-notch and so far ahead of most other headphones, but they don't quite have that planar flat extension sub-bass thunderous rumble. And you can just give them that and up the engagement factor by just adding a bass shelf. It really does make the headphones more enjoyable. You don't need it, but I would recommend trying it. Comparing the HEDDphone 2 to the original headphone, the most drastic improvements are in the build quality and ergonomics that we discussed earlier, but the drivers themselves have been revamped. They are smaller and lighter, but more powerful, and looking at the frequency response, the result is a bit more mid-range presence, around 400 to 700 Hz, and an overall more even treble response with less variation or peaks and dips. What stands out to me most overall about the HEDDphone 2 is how technically competent they are, how detailed they are. Without any kind of artificial brightness or forcing things. They sound incredibly natural, the timbre of vocals is absolutely top notch, whilst again having technical performance that I've otherwise only heard in electrostatic headphones. There's so much that I can compliment about this headphone, but only really 2 things that stand out to me as clear negatives. The first being that whilst the soundstage is incredibly wide, I do wish that it could go out in front of you a little bit further. And the second being that it would have been nice to see the sub-bass extension be a little bit more of a planar-esque flat response. It's not that the sub-bass is lacking on these, it's just that when it's got this level of technical ability in the bass, the not having that sub-bass extension almost becomes more prominent. And once you put it back in with EQ, it means you can take full advantage, but I just wish it was there by default. The HEDDphone 2 is one of the most resolving headphones you can buy. With a mid-range forward and vocal-focused tuning and some of the best and most innovative ergonomics I've seen in a headphone to date, if you're looking for your next headphone, particularly something to use as an all-rounder, the HEDDphone 2 is an excellent choice. I hope you found that video entertaining and useful, and if you'd like to come and ask myself and other Wiggly Air enthusiasts any questions about the HEDDphone 2 or anything else related to gear, music, or any other topic of your choice, come and say hi on our Discord server or the headphones.com forum. I'm Golden Sound, you're watching The Headphone Show by headphones.com. Until next time.